I was sitting in my corner office on the 47th floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Riverside when my assistant knocked and said, "Ms. Chen, your 2 p.m. interview is here." I glanced at my calendar and felt my stomach drop. The name staring back at me was one I knew better than any other. Isabella Chen. My sister. The same sister who, just 3 weeks ago at our cousin's wedding, had laughed in my face when I told her I worked in corporate consulting and said, quote, "At least someone in this family is willing to settle for mediocrity." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You see, Isabella had no idea that the, quote, dead-end office job she'd been mocking for the past 5 years was actually me running a $340 million company. She had no idea that her big sister Sophia, the one she called boring and unambitious, was the CEO she was about to interview with for her dream position. And she definitely had no idea that I'd been watching her career for months, quietly orchestrating this moment where her arrogance would finally catch up with her. My name is Sophia Chen, and if you stay with me for the next 20 minutes, I'll show you exactly how my sister's cruelty became the perfect setup for the most satisfying interview of my entire career. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's letting someone destroy themselves while you hold all the cards. But let me back up and explain how we got here. Because this story isn't just about one interview. It's about 5 years of systematic humiliation, family gatherings where I was treated like the family disappointment, and a sister who built her entire identity on being better than me. What Isabella never understood was that while she was busy posting LinkedIn updates about her executive aspirations and networking at expensive industry events, I was quietly building the exact company she desperately wanted to work for. The irony? She'd been applying to Meridian Dynamics for 8 months. 8 months of carefully crafted cover letters, strategic networking attempts, and increasingly desperate follow-up emails. She wanted this job more than anything she'd ever wanted in her life, and she had no idea that the person holding her future in their hands was the same sister she'd spent years calling a corporate drone with no vision. I still remember the exact moment I realized Isabella was applying to my company. It was a Tuesday morning, and my head of recruitment, Marcus Rivera, was reviewing applications for our new senior strategy director position. He mentioned an interesting candidate with a strong background from Pinnacle Industries, Isabella's current company, and asked if I wanted to review her file personally. When he slid the resume across my desk, and I saw my own last name staring back at me, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to process what was happening. My sister, who had spent our entire adult lives making me feel small and insignificant, was unknowingly begging me for a job. See, Isabella had always been the golden child. The one with the prestigious MBA from Hartwell Business School. The one who got fast-tracked into management at 26. The one who spoke at industry conferences and had her photo in business magazines. Growing up, she was everything my parents wanted in a daughter. Charismatic, ambitious, socially connected. I was the quiet one, the steady one, the one who played it safe with my career choices. At every family gathering, Isabella would hold court, talking about her latest promotion or her company's quarterly results while I sat in the corner, nodding politely when asked about my, quote, little consulting job. When she got engaged to her finance executive boyfriend, David, the first thing she said to me was, "Don't worry, Sophia. Not everyone can have a power couple career. Someone has to do the regular jobs too." When she bought her luxury condo in Belmont Hills, she made sure to mention that the down payment was more than my entire annual salary, or what she thought was my salary. When she got her latest promotion to VP of Strategic Development, she actually patted my shoulder and said, "Maybe you'll make it to management level someday if you really apply yourself." The worst part wasn't even the condescension, it was the way our parents ate it up. Every family dinner became the Isabella show, with mom and dad hanging on her every word while I became background noise. They'd ask her about market trends and business strategy, then turn to me with polite but disinterested questions about my office work. I learned to smile and nod. I learned to deflect questions about my career with vague answers about helping companies optimize their operations. I learned to let Isabella think she was the successful one while I was just getting by. What I never told anyone, not my parents, not my friends, certainly not Isabella, was what I was actually building. Because while Isabella was climbing the corporate ladder at someone else's company, I was creating my own empire. While she was networking her way into promotions, I was turning my boring consulting work into a multi-million-dollar business that now employed over 2,800 people across 4 countries. While she was celebrating her six-figure salary, I was sitting on a company valuation that would make her head spin. Meridian Dynamics wasn't just successful, it was the kind of company Isabella dreamed of working for. We'd been featured on the cover of Enterprise magazine twice in the past year. We'd won 3 industry innovation awards. We were the company that other companies hired when they needed to transform their entire business model. And now, Isabella wanted in. She wanted it so badly that she'd been calling our HR department weekly, asking about the status of her application. She'd connected with half our executive team on LinkedIn, hoping someone would notice her. She'd even started following our company blog and sharing our articles with comments like, "This is the kind of visionary thinking the industry needs." What she didn't know was that I'd been watching every move. Every application, every follow-up email, every desperate attempt to get our attention had crossed my desk. I'd seen her salary requirements, which were exactly what she'd been bragging about at family dinners. I'd read her cover letter, where she positioned herself as someone who could bring fresh perspective to traditional corporate structures. The position she was applying for, Senior Strategy Director, was one I'd specifically designed with her skill set in mind. Not because I wanted to help her, but because I wanted to see what would happen when her arrogance met reality. When the sister who thought I was beneath her had to sit across from me and explain why she deserved to work at my company. So when Marcus suggested we bring her in for an interview, I didn't hesitate. I told him to schedule it personally with me. No preliminary screening, no junior-level interviews. I wanted to see the look on Isabella's face when she walked into that conference room and realized that her unsuccessful sister was the one holding her career in her hands. That interview was scheduled for today, 2 p.m. sharp. And in about 30 seconds, Isabella was going to walk through my office door expecting to meet with some faceless executive, only to discover that the CEO of her dream company was the same person she'd been calling a failure for the past 5 years. I straightened my blazer, took a sip of my coffee, and smiled. Because after years of being treated like the family disappointment, I was about to show my sister exactly what real success looked like. Evie Imter. The intercom buzzed. Ms. Chen? Should I send her in? Absolutely, I said. Send her right in. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The door opened and Isabella walked in with that same confident stride she'd perfected over the years. Designer heels clicking against the marble floor. Tailored navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Hair pulled back in a sleek bun that screamed, executive material. She had her interview smile locked and loaded. The one she practiced in mirrors. The one that said she belonged in rooms like this. She was looking down at her phone, probably checking her notes one last time, when she finally glanced up and saw me sitting behind the executive desk. The transformation was instant and beautiful. Her confident smile flickered, then froze completely. Her eyes went wide, scanning the office as if she'd walked into the wrong building. She looked at the nameplate on my desk, Sophia Chen, Chief Executive Officer, then back at me, then at the nameplate again. I watched her brain trying to process what she was seeing, like a computer with a fatal error. Sophia? Her voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. What? What are you doing here? I leaned back in my leather chair, the same way I'd seen her do countless times when she was establishing dominance in a conversation. Hello, Isabella. Please, have a seat. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. I believe you're here for the Senior Strategy Director interview. She remained frozen in the doorway, her mouth slightly open. But you work in consulting. You told me you work in consulting. I do work in consulting, I said calmly, picking up her resume from my desk. Meridian Dynamics is a consulting firm. We help Fortune 500 companies optimize their strategic operations. I believe you mentioned in your cover letter that you're familiar with our work. The color was slowly draining from her face. She took a tentative step into the office, then another, like she was walking through a minefield. You're the CEO? For the past 3 years, yes. Though I founded the company 5 years ago. I kept my voice professional, neutral. Shall we begin the interview? I understand you've been quite eager to join our team. Isabella finally made it to the chair but didn't sit down. Instead, she gripped the back of it like she needed something to hold on to. This is impossible. You work for some tiny consulting company. You said you make presentations and analyze data. I do make presentations. to boards of directors mostly. And I do analyze data, market trends, competitor strategies, revenue projections. Yesterday, I presented our quarterly results to our investors. We're up 37% from last year. I paused, letting that sink in. But please, sit down. Let's discuss your qualifications. She sat down heavily, her polished composure completely shattered. For the first time in our adult lives, Isabella looked genuinely vulnerable. How is this possible? How long have you been? When did I start the company? Right after I left my position at Sterling and Associates. You know that dead-end corporate job you were so concerned about me being stuck in? I opened her file, though I'd memorized every word already. According to your application, you're interested in our Senior Strategy Director position. The salary range is $180,000 to $220,000, plus equity options. I believe that's within your stated requirements? Isabella's hands were shaking slightly. Sophia, I don't understand. If you're the CEO of this company, why didn't you ever say anything? Why did you let everyone think? Let everyone think what, exactly? I met her eyes directly. That I was unsuccessful? That I was the family disappointment? That I was settling for mediocrity? I quoted her exact words from the wedding and watched her wince. You didn't mean what? That you've spent the last 5 years telling our parents that I lack ambition? That you've made jokes about my little office job at every family gathering? That 3 weeks ago, you literally told our cousin Rebecca that at least she was smart enough not to plateau early like I did. Isabella's face went from pale to red. You heard that? I hear most things, Isabella. It's actually a useful skill in business. I picked up a pen and clicked at once, a habit I'd developed during difficult negotiations. But let's focus on you. According to your LinkedIn profile, you're currently VP of Strategic Development at Pinnacle Industries. Impressive title. What exactly does that role entail? She was struggling to regain her footing, trying to switch back into interview mode, but I could see the wheels turning. I oversee strategic partnerships and business development initiatives. I manage a team of 12, and I'm responsible for identifying new market opportunities. Interesting. And what would you say is your biggest professional accomplishment in that role? Isabella straightened up slightly, muscle memory kicking in. This was familiar territory for her, talking about her achievements. I led the acquisition integration for our merger with Coastal Enterprises last year. It was a $45 million deal, and I managed the transition process for over 200 employees. Impressive, I said, making a note. We actually consulted on a similar integration project recently, the Hartwell-Morrison merger. Perhaps you read about it in the industry publications? Her eyes widened again. Hartwell-Morrison had been front-page news in Business Weekly for 3 months. It was a $600 million deal that reshaped their entire sector. That was you? That was us. I personally managed the executive team transition. I set down my pen and folded my hands. Tell me, Isabella, what do you know about Meridian dynamics? Beyond what you've researched for this interview. She was floundering now, caught between her shock and her desperate need to impress me. I know the company is one of the leading strategic consulting firms in the region. You work with major corporations on operational transformation and growth strategies. We do. We also do international market expansion, executive coaching, and organizational restructuring. Last year, we opened offices in Singapore and London. This year, we're expanding into South America. I watched her process this information, knowing she was calculating exactly how successful her unsuccessful sister had become. The London office, she said quietly. You have an office in London? Kensington District, 30-person team. I was there last month for our quarterly review. I paused. You know, Isabella, I have to ask, when you were researching our company for this interview, didn't you ever look up the leadership team? Our executive bios are right on the website. She shook her head slowly. I focused on the job description and the company culture section. I thought the CEO was someone named S. Chen, but I never imagined. That S. Chen was your sister? I smiled for the first time since she'd walked in. The same sister who plays it safe with her career choices? The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of condescension and dismissal. Isabella was staring at her hands, probably replaying every conversation we'd had about work, every family dinner where she dominated the conversation with her career updates, while I sat quietly in the corner. Finally, she looked up at me. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you known I was applying here?" 8 months, since your first application." I kept my voice level. "I've seen every cover letter, every follow-up email, every attempt to network with our executives. You've been very persistent, and you never said anything. You let me keep applying, keep hoping. I let you demonstrate exactly how badly you wanted to work for my company," I corrected. "The same company you didn't even know was mine. The same success you couldn't see because you were too busy looking down at me to notice what I was actually building." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing the complete reversal of everything she thought she knew about our relationship. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" I picked up her resume again, though I could have recited it from memory. "Now? Now we continue with your interview. Unless, of course, you're no longer interested in the position?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella's dream job was sitting right in front of her, offered by the sister she'd spent years treating like a failure. And we both knew she was too ambitious to walk away, no matter how humiliated she felt. I'm still interested," she said finally. "Good," I replied, clicking my pen again. "Then let's talk about why you think you'd be a good fit for Meridian Dynamics." To understand how we got to this moment, me sitting across from my sister in an interview that would determine her career future, you need to understand how our relationship was built. Not the version our parents tell at holiday gatherings, where we're just two successful girls who took different paths. The real version, where one sister was groomed for greatness while the other was trained to be invisible. It started when we were kids in our childhood home in Maplewood Heights. Isabella was born with what my mother called natural leadership qualities. She was loud, demanding, charismatic in the way that made adults pay attention. When she was 4 years old, she convinced our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to buy Girl Scout cookies by telling her they were investment opportunities in my future success. When I was 4, I was organizing Isabella's toy collection by color and size, because mess made me anxious. Our parents, Dr. Margaret Chen and Professor James Chen, both academics at Riverside University, saw these differences and made a decision that would shape the next 20 years of our lives. Isabella was the natural-born leader who needed to be nurtured and challenged. I was the supportive type who would thrive in structured environments where I could help others succeed. They weren't malicious about it. They genuinely believed they were playing to our strengths. When Isabella demanded to be enrolled in debate club, student government, and advanced placement classes, they moved mountains to make it happen. When I expressed interest in the same activities, they gently redirected me toward more suitable options. "Sophia does so well with behind-the-scenes work," Mom would tell other parents. "She's our little organizer." By middle school, the pattern was set in stone. Isabella was student body president while I managed her campaign schedules. She was captain of the debate team while I researched her talking points. She got the lead in school plays while I handled props and scheduling. Our parents beamed with pride at every award ceremony where Isabella's name was called, and they'd give me encouraging smiles when I was recognized for outstanding support or exceptional teamwork. High school was where I first started to understand what was happening. Isabella was accepted into every honors program at Crescent Valley Academy, our elite private school. She had her pick of extracurriculars, from Model UN to the Investment Club. Her college counselor started talking about Ivy League schools when she was a sophomore. Meanwhile, I was channeled into what they called practical leadership opportunities. I ran the school's tutoring program, managed the library's computer systems, and somehow became the go-to person when anything needed organizing. I was good at it, really good, but it wasn't glamorous. While Isabella was giving speeches at regional conferences, I was building databases and streamlining processes that made everything run smoothly. The thing is, I started to notice something our parents missed. Isabella was brilliant at presenting ideas and inspiring people, but she struggled with execution. Her campaign promises rarely became reality. Her debate arguments were passionate but often lacked supporting data. Her Model UN resolutions sounded impressive but fell apart under scrutiny. I, on the other hand, had developed an entirely different skill set. I could see systems and understand how they connected. When the tutoring program was failing, I didn't just motivate people. I redesigned the entire matching process and created accountability measures that tripled our success rate. When the school's fundraising was stuck, I didn't give inspiring speeches. I analyzed their donor data and identified untapped revenue streams that brought in $40,000 more than the previous year. But nobody called what I was doing leadership. They called it support work or administrative excellence. Isabella got credit for the program's successes because she was the face of them, while I was the invisible engine making everything work. College applications were when the inequality became impossible to ignore. Isabella applied to Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and every other prestigious business program in the country. Our parents hired a private counselor, paid for test prep courses, and spent hours helping her craft essays about her, quote, vision for transformative leadership. When it was my turn, they suggested I look at solid-state schools with strong business programs. Nothing wrong with practical choices, they said. Not everyone needs to be at the very top. I ended up at Riverside State University, a good school, but nobody was impressed when I mentioned it at family gatherings. Isabella got into 3 Ivy League schools and chose Hartwell Business School, where she majored in strategic management and minored in entrepreneurship. Our parents threw a graduation party with 50 guests when she finished. When I graduated summa cum laude with degrees in business analytics and information systems, we had dinner at a restaurant. But here's what nobody knew during those college years. While Isabella was networking at campus mixers and joining prestigious clubs, I was quietly building something that would change everything. It started with a work-study job in the university's business consulting office. They needed someone to organize client files and manage appointment schedules. Basic administrative work. Within 6 months, I was sitting in client meetings. Not because anyone invited me, but because I'd started noticing patterns in the problems companies brought to us. I'd read through every case file, analyzed every consulting report, and begun to see connections that even the professors missed. Professor Williams, who ran the consulting office, first noticed when I handed him a memo about a client's inventory management issues. He'd been working on their case for weeks, trying to figure out why their costs were spiraling. I'd spent one evening going through their data and identified 3 inefficiencies that were bleeding money. Not only that, I'd outlined specific solutions and calculated the potential savings. "How did you see this?" he asked me, staring at my recommendations. "I just looked at what they were actually doing instead of what they said they were doing," I replied. That memo turned into consulting opportunities. Professor Williams started bringing me into client meetings, first as a note-taker, then as an analyst, then eventually as a project lead. By senior year, I was managing consulting projects that brought in 6-figure contracts for the university. Meanwhile, Isabella was having the time of her life at Hartwell. She joined 3 business fraternities, studied abroad in London, and landed a prestigious summer internship at Morrison & Associates through a family connection. She called me regularly to share stories about her networking successes and the important people she was meeting. "You should really think about getting an MBA after you graduate," she told me during one of these calls. "I know it seems intimidating, but there are some good regional programs that might accept you. Not everyone needs to go to a top school." I didn't tell her that Professor Williams had already approached me about staying on as a full-time consultant. I didn't mention that I'd been offered a position at Sterling & Associates, the same firm where Isabella desperately wanted to work after graduation. And I definitely didn't tell her about the business plan I'd been developing on the side, the one that was keeping me up until 3 a.m. every night. Instead, I said, "Thanks for the advice, Isabella. I'll definitely consider it." Because even then, I was learning the most important lesson of my life: people will underestimate you if you let them. And sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest competitive advantage you can have. When graduation came, Isabella walked across the stage at Hartwell to thunderous applause from our entire extended family. She'd graduated magna cum laude with a job offer from Pinnacle Industries. Not her first choice, but still impressive. Our parents couldn't stop talking about their executive daughter and her bright future in corporate leadership. I graduated 3 weeks later with the highest GPA in my program and a consulting offer that paid more than Isabella's starting salary. But by then, I'd already made a different decision. I was going to take the Sterling & Associates position for exactly 1 year, learn everything I could about high-level corporate consulting, and then launch my own firm. The night before I started at Sterling, Isabella called to give me advice about succeeding in corporate America. "The key is visibility," she told me. "Make sure people know who you are and what you're capable of. Don't just blend into the background." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, staring at the business plan spread across my desk. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already learned something much more valuable. The most powerful position isn't always the most visible one. Sometimes, The best strategy is to let everyone else fight for the spotlight while you quietly build an empire they never saw coming. And that empire? It was about to become Meridian Dynamics. My year at Sterling & Associates was supposed to be a learning experience. What I didn't expect was that it would become a masterclass in watching Isabella's career trajectory, while building my own foundation in complete secrecy. Because the thing about being the invisible sister is that people tell you things they'd never share with someone they saw as competition. Isabella landed her position at Pinnacle Industries 3 months after graduation, and suddenly every family gathering became a detailed briefing on her rapid ascent through corporate America. She started as a junior strategy analyst, but within 6 months she was promoted to senior analyst, then to strategy coordinator 9 months later. By the end of her first year, she was leading client presentations and managing small project teams. Isabella has such natural executive presence. Our mother would gush during our monthly family dinners. Her supervisor told her she's the fastest rising talent they've seen in years. What Mom didn't know was that I'd been quietly tracking Isabella's career through industry connections I'd made at Sterling. The consulting world in Riverside is smaller than people think, and information flows freely between firms when you know the right people. Marcus Rivera, who would later become my head of recruitment, was working at a boutique firm that occasionally partnered with Pinnacle. Through him, I learned things about Isabella's work that she'd never shared with our family, like the fact that her rapid promotions were actually lateral moves with inflated titles. Pinnacle Industries had a notorious reputation for giving impressive-sounding job titles to keep young employees happy while paying them below market rate. Isabella's strategy coordination role was essentially project management with a fancy name, or that her celebrated client presentations were actually group efforts where she handled the delivery, while more senior analysts did the heavy analytical lifting. Isabella was gifted at making complex ideas sound accessible and compelling, but she struggled with the technical depth that clients expected when they asked follow-up questions. The most telling detail came from a conversation Marcus had with a Pinnacle director at an industry mixer. "That Chen girl is great in meetings," the director had said. "Real charisma, knows how to work a room. But honestly, we have to pair her with stronger analytical minds to make sure the substance is there." Meanwhile, my experience at Sterling was the complete opposite. I'd been hired as a research analyst, expecting to spend my time building databases and creating reports. Instead, I found myself pulled into increasingly complex strategic projects, because I had a talent for seeing solutions that others missed. My breakthrough moment came during my 4th month, when Sterling was brought in to help Cloudmark Technologies restructure their operations after a failed merger. The senior partners had been working on the case for 6 weeks, trying to untangle a mess of duplicate departments, conflicting processes, and demoralized employees. The client was threatening to terminate our contract if we couldn't show meaningful progress within 2 weeks. I spent a weekend diving deep into Cloudmark's organizational data, employee surveys, and financial records. What I found was that everyone was focused on the obvious problems, the redundant positions and inefficient workflows, while missing the underlying issue. The merger had failed because the two companies had fundamentally different approaches to customer service, and that disconnect was cascading through every other operational area. My solution wasn't to eliminate redundancies, but to create parallel tracks that leveraged each company's strengths while gradually integrating their customer-facing processes. Instead of firing people, we'd retrain them. Instead of choosing one system over another, we'd build bridges between them that would eventually evolve into something better than either original approach. When I presented this to the senior partners, expecting them to polish it and present it to the client, they sent me to the client meeting instead. "This is your insight," said Patricia Hoffman, Sterling's managing partner. "You should be the one to explain it." The Cloudmark restructuring became Sterling's most successful project that year. Not only did we save the client $12 million in redundancy costs, but the new integrated system actually increased their customer satisfaction scores by 34% within 6 months. More importantly for me, it established my reputation as someone who could solve complex organizational problems that stumped more experienced consultants. Word spread quickly through Riverside's business community. Within months, I was being requested specifically for high-stakes strategic projects. Companies that had never heard of me were asking Sterling to put that analyst who figured out the Cloudmark situation on their cases. But here's where the pattern with Isabella became truly revealing. Every time I achieved something significant at Sterling, she'd have a news story about her own success at Pinnacle that somehow managed to overshadow mine during family conversations. When I told our parents about leading the Cloudmark project, Isabella announced that she'd been chosen to represent Pinnacle at the Regional Business Development Conference. When I mentioned that Sterling was considering fast-tracking me for a senior position, Isabella shared that she was being mentored by Pinnacle's VP of Strategic Development. When I got my first profile in the Riverside Business Journal for innovative problem-solving, Isabella casually mentioned that she'd been quoted in the same publication about industry trends. The thing was, I'd started verifying these claims through my professional network. The conference Isabella attended? It was a standard industry event where Pinnacle had purchased a booth and needed someone presentable to staff it. Her mentorship with the VP? A monthly check-in meeting that every analyst in her department attended. Her quote in the Business Journal? A single-sentence response to a reporter who was gathering general industry commentary. None of these things were lies, exactly, but they were strategic presentations of routine career activities designed to sound more impressive than they actually were. Isabella had mastered the art of personal branding, turning ordinary professional experiences into compelling narrative moments that dominated our family's attention. Meanwhile, I was building something much more substantial, but I was doing it quietly. By my 8th month at Sterling, I was essentially functioning as a junior partner, leading my own projects and managing client relationships. Patricia Hoffman started including me in business development meetings, not just as an analyst, but as someone whose strategic insights could help Sterling win new contracts. "You have an unusual gift," she told me during one of our monthly reviews. "Most consultants are either great at analysis or great at implementation. You understand both the technical details and the human dynamics that make solutions actually work." But the most significant development happened during my 10th month at Sterling, when I was assigned to help Meridian Enterprises, a mid-sized manufacturing company, optimize their supply chain operations. It was supposed to be a straightforward efficiency project, the kind of work I could handle in my sleep. What I discovered was that Meridian's real problem wasn't operational inefficiency. They were losing market share because they couldn't adapt quickly enough to changing customer demands. Their entire business model was built around long-term contracts and predictable production cycles, but their industry was moving toward just-in-time delivery and customized solutions. Instead of just optimizing their existing supply chain, I proposed a complete transformation, a consulting division that would help other companies navigate similar operational challenges. Meridian had deep industry knowledge and established vendor relationships. With the right strategic framework, they could monetize that expertise while diversifying their revenue streams. The proposal I presented wasn't just a supply chain optimization plan. It was a business model that could transform Meridian from a regional manufacturer into a national consulting powerhouse. And as I was researching comparable firms and market opportunities, I realized something that would change my life. I wasn't just solving their problem. I was discovering my own future. Because what I'd outlined for Meridian Enterprises wasn't just their potential business model. It was the blueprint for Meridian Dynamics, the consulting firm I was going to build. The company that would eventually employ over 2,800 people and generate hundreds of millions in revenue. The company where, 5 years later, my sister would sit across from me in an interview, having no idea that the dead-end job she'd been mocking was actually the foundation of an empire she desperately wanted to join. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before I could build Meridian Dynamics, I had to finish my year at Sterling. And more importantly, I had to watch Isabella achieve what she thought was the pinnacle of early career success. Her promotion to VP of Strategic Development at Pinnacle Industries. The promotion she'd been working toward for 2 years. The title that would finally put her on the executive track she'd always envisioned for herself. The achievement that would make our parents prouder than they'd ever been. The same promotion that would blind her to what I was actually building, because she'd be too busy celebrating her own success to notice that her unsuccessful sister was about to leave corporate consulting entirely and become her own boss. What Isabella never realized during those early years of her corporate climb was that every family dinner where she dominated the conversation was actually a masterclass in competitive intelligence. While she was busy impressing our parents with stories about her latest achievements, I was quietly learning everything I needed to know about the industry, the players, and most importantly, the gaps in the market that no one else was seeing. You see, Isabella had made a critical assumption about me that would prove to be her downfall. She believed that because I didn't talk about my work with the same enthusiasm she did, I wasn't paying attention to hers. She thought my quiet questions about her projects were just polite interest from a less successful sister. What she didn't realize was that I was systematically studying her industry, her company, and her approach to business development. During my final months at Sterling & Associates, while Isabella was celebrating her promotion to VP of Strategic Development, I was quietly laying the groundwork for something much bigger. I'd started what I called my Midnight MBA, spending every evening after work diving deep into case studies, market analysis, and strategic planning frameworks that weren't part of my day job. The beauty of working at a consulting firm was the access it gave me to intelligence about dozens of different industries. Every client engagement was essentially a graduate-level course in how businesses succeed or fail. I studied retail chains struggling with digital transformation, manufacturing companies grappling with global supply chains, and tech startups trying to scale their operations. Each project taught me something new about the fundamental challenges that companies face when they try to grow. But more importantly, I was identifying patterns that even Sterling's senior partners weren't seeing. There was a massive gap in the market for consultants who could bridge the divide between high-level strategy and practical implementation. Most consulting firms were either boutique specialists who could solve narrow technical problems, or massive multinational firms like McKinsey and Bain, who focused on board-level strategy, but left companies to figure out execution on their own. What was missing was a firm that could do both, develop sophisticated strategic frameworks, and then stick around to help companies actually implement them. A firm that understood that the most brilliant strategy in the world is worthless if you can't execute it effectively. This insight came to me during a particularly frustrating client engagement with Riverside Medical Systems. Sterling had been hired to help them optimize their patient flow processes, which should have been a straightforward operational consulting project. We'd identified the problems, designed elegant solutions, and presented a comprehensive implementation plan. 6 months later, nothing had changed. The issue wasn't our analysis. It was perfect. The problem was that Riverside's management team didn't have the internal expertise to execute our recommendations. They needed ongoing support, training for their staff, and someone to troubleshoot problems as they arose. But Sterling's business model didn't include long-term implementation support. We were paid to analyze and recommend, not to hold hands through execution. That's when I realized the opportunity. What if there was a consulting firm specifically designed around implementation support? What if instead of just selling reports, we sold transformations? What if our business model was built around staying with clients until they achieved measurable results? I started testing this concept during my regular work at Sterling, but I was careful to frame it as client service rather than business development. When Riverside Medical Systems struggled with implementing our recommendations, I volunteered to do quarterly check-ins to monitor their progress. When Cloudmark Technologies wanted help training their managers on the new integrated processes, I offered to design and deliver the training program. Patricia Hoffman noticed these extra efforts, but she interpreted them as exceptional client service rather than market research. "You're really going above and beyond," she told me during one of our reviews. Most consultants hand over their reports and move on to the next project. What she didn't know was that I was building something much more valuable than client goodwill. I was developing proof of concept for a completely different approach to consulting. And more importantly, I was building relationships with companies that would become my first clients when I launched Meridian Dynamics. Meanwhile, Isabella's success at Pinnacle was becoming more visible to our entire extended family. She'd started getting invited to speak at industry conferences, not as a keynote speaker, but as part of panel discussions about emerging talent and strategic development. Our parents would forward me links to conference websites where Isabella's bio appeared alongside more senior executives. "Look at this," Mom would say, showing me her phone during our Sunday dinners. "Isabella is speaking at the West Coast Business Innovation Summit. She's really making a name for herself." I would nod and smile, expressing appropriate sisterly pride, while mentally cataloging every detail about these events. Who else was speaking? What companies were sponsoring? What topics were they covering? Isabella had no idea that her conference appearances were giving me valuable intelligence about industry trends and key players. The most useful information came from Isabella herself when she'd call me after these events to decompress. She was genuinely excited about her work, and she'd share details about conversations she'd had with other speakers, insights she'd gained about different companies' strategies, and gossip about personnel changes at major firms. "You won't believe who I met at the Innovation Summit," she told me after one particularly successful conference. "David Chen, no relation, different Chen family, who runs strategic partnerships at TechFlow Dynamics. He said they're looking for consulting support for a major expansion project, but they're frustrated with the big firms because they just want to sell expensive reports without helping with actual implementation." I almost dropped the phone. This was exactly the market gap I'd been identifying through my own research, confirmed by a potential client Isabella had just handed me on a silver platter. But instead of revealing my interest, I just said, "That's interesting. It sounds like there's a real opportunity for the right kind of consulting firm."
"Definitely," Isabella agreed. "Too bad there aren't more firms that specialize in implementation support." David said they'd pay premium rates for consultants who could actually stick around and help them execute strategies, instead of just designing them. That conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in October. By Friday, I had outlined the complete business plan for Meridian Dynamics. By the following Tuesday, I'd scheduled lunch with David Chen to discuss TechFlow's consulting needs. And by the end of that month, I had my first signed client contract for a company that didn't exist yet. But the most important development during this period wasn't business-related. It was personal. I was learning to see Isabella's success not as competition, but as market research. Every achievement she celebrated, every connection she made, every insight she shared was helping me build a more comprehensive understanding of the industry I was about to enter. More importantly, I was learning to use her assumptions about me as a strategic advantage. Because Isabella was so focused on her own career trajectory, she never questioned why I was so interested in hearing about her work. She assumed my questions came from admiration rather than analysis. She interpreted my quiet responses as evidence that I wasn't ambitious enough to be a threat. This gave me something invaluable: complete access to information about my future competition without them knowing I was gathering intelligence. Isabella would tell me about Pinnacle's client strategies, their pricing models, their staffing challenges, and their business development approaches. She thought she was sharing sisterly updates about her professional life. What she was actually doing was providing me with competitive intelligence that would help me design a better business model. The turning point came during the holidays that year, when our entire extended family gathered at our parents' house for Christmas dinner. Isabella had just been featured in Riverside Business Monthly's 30 Under 30 Inches list, and she brought copies of the magazine to share with everyone. As I watched her hold court at the dinner table, explaining her strategic vision for Pinnacle's future growth and her role in developing new market opportunities, I realized something profound. Isabella had taught me everything I needed to know about how not to build a consulting business. She was focused on personal branding instead of client results. She was optimizing for recognition rather than impact. She was building a career instead of building solutions. And most importantly, she was so confident in her own trajectory that she'd never see the competition coming until it was too late. That night, after everyone had gone home and Isabella had driven back to her apartment to prepare for a client presentation the next morning, I sat in my childhood bedroom and finalized the incorporation paperwork for Meridian Dynamics. My sister had just given me the blueprint for everything I needed to do differently, and she had no idea that her success story was about to become the foundation for mine. The moment I walked into Patricia Hoffman's office to submit my resignation letter, I knew there was no going back. It was February 15th, exactly 13 months after I'd started at Sterling & Associates, and I was about to make the leap that would change everything. But what made this moment so perfect wasn't just that I was finally launching Meridian Dynamics. It was that Isabella had no idea what was coming. Just 3 days earlier, she'd called me with the biggest news of her career. Pinnacle Industries had been acquired by Global Tech Solutions in a $280 million deal, and as part of the integration, Isabella was being promoted to Senior Director of Strategic Integration. It was exactly the kind of high-profile corporate success she'd been working toward her entire life. "Sophia, you have to understand how huge this is," she'd said, practically vibrating with excitement through the phone. "Global Tech is one of the top 3 consulting firms in the region. This promotion puts me on the executive track. I'll be managing a team of 30 people and overseeing integration projects worth tens of millions of dollars." I congratulated her appropriately, asked the right questions about her new responsibilities, and listened as she explained how this position would position her for even bigger opportunities down the road. What I didn't tell her was that Global Tech Solutions had been on my radar for months as a potential competitor, and that I'd already identified several weaknesses in their business model that Meridian Dynamics was specifically designed to exploit.
"The best part," Isabella continued, "is that I'll finally be working on the kind of transformational projects that really matter. Not just small efficiency improvements, but complete organizational restructuring, the kind of work that changes how entire companies operate." As she spoke, I was looking at the client contracts spread across my desk. TechFlow Dynamics, Meridian Manufacturing, Riverside Medical Systems, and 2 other companies that were waiting for exactly the kind of transformational consulting Isabella thought she was going to do at Global Tech. The difference was that my clients weren't waiting for a massive corporate integration to be completed. They were ready to start immediately, and they wanted to work with a firm that would be completely focused on their success, rather than managing internal politics at a newly merged organization. When Patricia Hoffman read my resignation letter, her first reaction was shock, then concern, then something that looked almost like pride. "I knew this day would come," she said, setting the letter down on her desk. "You've been building towards something bigger than Sterling from the moment you walked in here. The question is, are you sure you're ready?" It was a fair question. Launching a consulting firm at 24 was audacious under any circumstances, but doing it while keeping the entire venture secret from my family added a layer of complexity that could have been overwhelming. But I'd spent 13 months preparing for this moment, and I was as ready as anyone could be. I have 5 signed clients, 18 months of operating capital, and a business model that I've tested extensively, I told her. Plus, I've learned everything I can learn here. It's time to build something new. Patricia smiled. "What's the firm called?" "Meridian Dynamics." "And you're not telling your family yet?" This was the part I'd been dreading explaining to anyone, because it sounded petty when you said it out loud. How do you tell your former boss that you're keeping your entrepreneurial venture secret because you want to see how far you can go without the interference of family expectations? "I want to establish the company's success on its own merits," I said carefully. "My family has very specific ideas about business success, and I want to prove that my approach works before I have to defend it to people who might not understand it." What I didn't say was that I wanted to see how Isabella's new role at Global Tech would play out. I wanted to watch her navigate the politics of a major corporate merger while I was building something that could eventually compete with her new employer. I wanted to know whether she'd notice when Meridian Dynamics started winning clients that Global Tech was pursuing. Most importantly, I wanted to see whether Isabella would recognize my company's success when she encountered it in the market, or whether her assumptions about my capabilities would blind her to what I was building. The first test came sooner than I expected. 3 weeks after I launched Meridian Dynamics, Isabella called me with a work problem that was keeping her up at night. Global Tech's integration with Pinnacle wasn't going as smoothly as expected, and she was struggling to manage the cultural differences between the two organizations. "It's like trying to merge 2 completely different languages," she explained. "Pinnacle's people are used to collaborative decision-making and long-term relationship building. Global Tech's culture is all about efficiency and rapid execution. Every meeting turns into a negotiation about how we're going to approach projects going forward." As she described the challenges, I realized that she was dealing with exactly the kind of organizational integration problem that Meridian Dynamics was designed to solve. We specialized in helping companies navigate complex transitions by creating bridge processes that honored both cultures while moving toward unified goals. But instead of offering to help, I asked questions that guided her toward solutions she could present as her own insights. It was a strange experience, using my professional expertise to help my sister succeed at a company I was now competing against, while keeping my own firm's capabilities completely hidden. "Have you considered creating parallel workflow processes that gradually converge?" I suggested. "Instead of forcing immediate integration, you could design systems that allow both cultures to contribute their strengths while working toward common objectives." Isabella was quiet for a moment, processing the idea. "That's actually brilliant," she said. "Instead of choosing one approach over another, we create a bridge that becomes its own unified approach over time." Exactly. You're not eliminating differences, you're synthesizing them into something stronger. The strategy I'd outlined for Isabella was almost identical to one I'd used successfully with 3 different clients over the past month. But as far as she knew, it was just common sense advice from her supportive sister, who worked in basic consulting. 2 weeks later, Isabella called again, this time with pure excitement in her voice. "Sophia, you're not going to believe this. I presented that integration approach to the executive team, and they loved it. Not only are we implementing it across all our merger projects, but they want me to develop it into a standardized methodology that Global Tech can use for future acquisitions." I felt a complex mix of pride and irony as she described her success. Pride because the strategy was working exactly as I designed it to work. Irony because Isabella was now being celebrated for innovations that came directly from the business model she didn't know I'd created. "They're even talking about having me present this methodology at the National Business Integration Conference this fall," she continued. "This could be the breakthrough that establishes me as a thought leader in organizational transformation." As Isabella spoke about her rising profile at Global Tech, I was looking at my own calendar, which was packed with client meetings for the next 6 weeks. Meridian Dynamics had grown from 5 clients to 12 in just 2 months, and we were already getting referrals from companies that were impressed with our results. More importantly, we were starting to get noticed by the same industry publications that covered Global Tech's activities. The Riverside Business Journal had scheduled an interview with me about innovative approaches to strategic consulting, And Regional Enterprise magazine wanted to feature Meridian Dynamics in their quarterly spotlight on emerging firms. But the most significant development was a call I'd received that morning from David Park, the managing director of Crescent Valley Capital. They were a mid-size investment firm that specialized in growth equity for professional services companies, and they'd heard about Meridian Dynamics through our work with TechFlow Dynamics. "We're always interested in consulting firms that can demonstrate measurable client results," David had told me. "Most firms in your space struggle to scale because they're built around individual expertise rather than systematic methodologies. But from what we're hearing, you've developed something different." The conversation had been preliminary, but the implications were enormous. If Meridian Dynamics could attract growth capital, we could expand much faster than I'd originally planned. We could hire senior consultants, open additional offices, and compete directly with firms like Global Tech for major corporate clients. We could become the kind of company that would eventually recruit talent from our competitors. The kind of company that would post job openings that might attract applications from ambitious executives looking for better opportunities. The kind of company that might, someday, receive a resume from Isabella Chen. As I listened to her celebrate her success at Global Tech, I realized that everything was proceeding exactly as I'd hoped. Isabella was establishing herself as a rising star in the traditional consulting world, building her reputation and her network, while remaining completely unaware that her little sister was building something that could eventually challenge everything she thought she knew about the industry. The game wasn't just changing, it had already changed. Isabella just didn't know it yet. But she would, because the next phase of my plan involved making Meridian Dynamics visible enough that even someone as focused on her own success as Isabella couldn't ignore it. And when that moment came, I wanted to see whether she'd recognize the company her sister had built, or whether she'd see it as just another competitor in a market she thought she understood. Either way, the conversation was going to be fascinating. 6 months after launching Meridian Dynamics, I was sitting in my temporary office space in the Riverside Business Center, staring at a spreadsheet that would have made Isabella's head spin. We'd just closed our biggest contract to date, a $2.8 million organizational transformation project with Pacific Northwest Industries, and our revenue projections for the next quarter were exceeding every goal I'd set when I started the company. But the numbers weren't what had me excited. What had me excited was the strategic plan I'd been developing for the past 3 months. A plan that would position Meridian Dynamics not just as a successful consulting firm, but as the kind of company that top talent would fight to join. The kind of company that would attract applications from executives at our competitors, including the newly merged Global Tech Solutions. The plan had 4 phases, and I was already deep into Phase 2. Phase 1 had been establishment and credibility. I'd focused on delivering exceptional results for our initial clients, building a reputation for the kind of implementation-focused consulting that larger firms couldn't match. We'd solved problems that traditional consultants couldn't solve, and we'd done it with measurable outcomes that clients could quantify in their own success metrics. The TechFlow Dynamics project alone had generated $18 million in cost savings over 6 months. Riverside Medical Systems had improved their patient satisfaction scores by 42%, while reducing operational costs by 23%. Every client engagement was designed not just to solve immediate problems, but to create case studies that would demonstrate our unique value proposition to the broader market. Phase 2 was strategic expansion and market positioning. This was where I was now, and it involved 3 key initiatives that would transform Meridian Dynamics from a boutique firm into a major regional player. First, I was establishing our physical presence in a way that would signal serious ambition. The temporary office space had served its purpose, but we needed headquarters that would impress both clients and potential employees. I'd signed a lease for the entire 47th floor of the Meridian Tower, the same building where I would eventually conduct Isabella's interview, with space for 150 employees and conference facilities that could handle major client presentations. Second, I was building a senior leadership team that could handle the kind of complex, high-value projects that would put us in direct competition with firms like Global Tech. Marcus Rivera had agreed to leave his position at Thornton Associates to become our head of recruitment and client development. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who'd built and sold 2 successful consulting firms, was joining as our chief operating officer. David Kim, a former McKinsey partner, was coming aboard to lead our strategic planning division. These weren't just impressive hires. They were people who understood how to scale a professional services business and had networks that would give us access to Fortune 500 clients. More importantly, they were people who believed in the implementation-focused model I'd developed and wanted to prove that it could outperform traditional consulting approaches. Third, and most strategically, I was developing our methodology into something that could be systematized, taught, and replicated across multiple client engagements. The Meridian method wasn't just a consulting approach. It was a proprietary framework that combined strategic analysis with hands-on implementation support, backed by data analytics and change management expertise that most firms couldn't match. What made this particularly valuable was that we could demonstrate ROI in ways that traditional consultants couldn't. While other firms delivered reports and recommendations, we delivered transformations. While they measured success by client satisfaction surveys, we measured success by quantifiable business improvements that showed up in our clients' financial statements. But phase 3 was where the plan got really interesting, because that's where I would start targeting Global Tech's client base directly. I'd been studying Global Tech's public client list, their case studies, and their approach to major consulting engagements. What I'd discovered was that their post-merger integration had created exactly the kind of organizational inefficiencies that gave smaller, more agile firms like ours a competitive advantage. Global Tech was trying to serve large corporate clients with a newly merged team that was still figuring out how to work together. Their project timelines had stretched longer than normal while they integrated Pinnacle's collaborative approach with Global Tech's efficiency-focused methodology. Several of their major clients had expressed frustration with delays and communication issues that stemmed from internal culture clashes. This created an opening for Meridian Dynamics to position ourselves as the solution to problems that Global Tech was inadvertently creating. We could approach their frustrated clients with a simple value proposition. We're the firm that gets results while the big firms are busy managing their own internal politics. I'd already identified 12 Global Tech clients whose contracts were coming up for renewal in the next 18 months. These were companies that had been working with Global Tech for years, but might be open to alternatives if they could see demonstrable advantages. My plan was to target these clients strategically, not by bad-mouthing Global Tech, but by showcasing the kind of measurable results that our implementation-focused approach could deliver. The beauty of this strategy was that it would force Global Tech to compete with us on our terms. They'd have to prove that their traditional consulting model could deliver the same kinds of quantifiable outcomes that Meridian Dynamics was generating. And based on my research into their recent project performance, I wasn't confident they could do that while they were still dealing with post-merger integration challenges. But phase 4 was the masterpiece, because that's where I would start recruiting top talent from our competitors, including Global Tech. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. As Meridian Dynamics grew and gained recognition, we'd naturally attract attention from ambitious consultants who wanted to be part of something innovative and successful. We'd post positions for senior-level roles that would appeal to executives who felt constrained by the bureaucracy and politics of larger firms. The job descriptions would be carefully crafted to appeal to people who were frustrated with traditional consulting limitations. Senior Strategy Director, Implementation Focus. VP of Client Transformation, Results-Driven Environment. Executive Director, Measurable Impact Consulting. These weren't just job titles. They were invitations for ambitious consultants to join a firm where they could focus on results rather than internal politics. And here's where the plan got personal. I was specifically designing these positions to appeal to someone with Isabella's background and ambitions. Someone who'd been successful in traditional consulting but might be ready for something more entrepreneurial. Someone who'd demonstrated leadership capabilities but was working within organizational constraints that limited their impact. Someone who might be getting frustrated with the post-merger dynamics at Global Tech and looking for opportunities to have more direct influence on client outcomes. I wasn't planning to recruit Isabella specifically. That would have been too obvious and potentially backfired. But I was planning to create the kind of opportunity that someone like Isabella would find irresistible. And when that moment came, I wanted to see whether she'd recognize the company her sister had built, or whether she'd approach it as just another career opportunity. The timeline for this strategy was 18 to 24 months. By then, Meridian Dynamics would be established enough to be seen as a legitimate competitor to firms like Global Tech. We'd have a track record of success, a reputation for innovation, and the kind of growth trajectory that ambitious consultants would want to be part of. By then, Isabella would have had enough time to experience the realities of working for a large, newly merged firm. She'd understand the limitations of traditional consulting approaches and the frustrations of trying to drive change within bureaucratic structures. And by then, I'd be ready to see whether the sister who'd spent years telling me I lacked ambition would be interested in working for the company I'd built while she was celebrating her own success. But first, I had to execute phases 2 and 3 flawlessly. I had to build Meridian Dynamics into the kind of firm that could legitimately compete with Global Tech for major clients and top talent. I had to prove that my approach to consulting wasn't just different. It was better. And I had to do all of this while keeping my family completely unaware of what I was building, so that when the moment of revelation finally came, it would have maximum impact. The plan was ambitious, complex, and required perfect execution over multiple years. But as I looked at our client results, our growth trajectory, and the team I was assembling, I knew it was going to work. Isabella had taught me everything I needed to know about traditional consulting success. Now it was time to show her what success looked like when you threw out the traditional playbook and built something entirely new. The first crack in Isabella's perfect corporate world appeared on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 14 months after I'd launched Meridian Dynamics. She called me at 7:30 a.m., which was unusual because Isabella was normally already in client meetings by that time. Her voice had an edge to it that I'd never heard before. Not panic, but something close to it. "Sophia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," she said without any preamble. "Have you ever heard of a company called Meridian Dynamics?" I nearly choked on my coffee. This wasn't how I'd expected the moment of discovery to unfold. I'd been preparing for Isabella to find out about my company gradually, through industry recognition or client connections. I hadn't anticipated her calling me directly to ask about it. "The name sounds familiar," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because they just stole one of our biggest clients, and nobody at Global Tech can figure out how they did it." Isabella's frustration was evident in every word. Hartwell Manufacturing was supposed to renew their contract with us next month. We've been working with them for 3 years, and the relationship was solid. Then out of nowhere, they announced they're switching to this Meridian Dynamics firm that I've never even heard of. I knew exactly how we'd won the Hartwell Manufacturing contract, because I'd personally overseen every aspect of the proposal and presentation. Hartwell had been frustrated with Global Tech's approach to their operational efficiency project. After 18 months of analysis and recommendations, they still hadn't seen meaningful improvements in their production metrics. When Hartwell's CEO, Patricia Morrison, reached out to us through a referral from TechFlow Dynamics, she was blunt about what she needed. "We want consultants who can actually fix our problems, not just identify them. We've had enough reports. We need results." Our proposal to Hartwell was everything Global Tech's wasn't. Instead of a 6-month analysis phase followed by recommendations, we offered a 12-month transformation partnership with guaranteed performance metrics. We committed to staying on-site until their production efficiency improved by at least 25%, their waste reduction targets were met, and their quality control scores reached industry benchmarks. Most importantly, we backed up our promises with a success-based fee structure. If we didn't deliver the measurable improvements we'd promised, Hartwell would pay us significantly less than our standard rates. If we exceeded their targets, we'd earn bonus compensation tied to their actual cost savings. It was exactly the kind of implementation-focused, results-driven approach that traditional consulting firms like Global Tech couldn't match because their business models weren't designed around sustained client engagement. "What do you know about this Meridian Dynamics company?" Isabella continued, and I could hear her typing in the background, probably researching us while we talked. "Their website makes them sound like they specialize in exactly the kind of work we do, but with some kind of implementation guarantee that I don't understand how any consulting firm could offer." "Implementation guarantee?" I asked, feigning ignorance while secretly proud that our value proposition was confusing our competitors. "They promise measurable results within specific timeframes, and apparently they back it up with performance-based contracts. It's either brilliant or insane, and I can't figure out which." Isabella paused, and I heard more typing. "The CEO is someone named S. Chen, but there's barely any information about them online. No conference speeches, no published articles, no LinkedIn profile that I can find. It's like they appeared out of nowhere with a fully formed company. This was intentional. I deliberately kept a low public profile during Meridian Dynamics' first year, focusing on building client relationships and internal capabilities rather than personal branding. Unlike Isabella, who'd built her career around visibility and industry recognition, I'd built mine around results that spoke for themselves. "Maybe they're just a newer firm," I suggested. "Sometimes the best consultants are the ones who focus on client work instead of marketing themselves." "Maybe," Isabella said, but she didn't sound convinced. The thing that's really bothering me is that Hartwell's CEO specifically said they chose Meridian Dynamics because they were tired of working with firms that, quote, "talk a lot but don't stick around to ensure success." That sounds like a direct criticism of our approach. It was a direct criticism of their approach, because I'd designed our methodology specifically to address the limitations I'd observed in traditional consulting models. But I couldn't tell Isabella that her client's criticism was actually validation of everything I'd been building. "What did your team say when they found out about losing the contract?" I asked. "That's the worst part. Our account manager, Trevor Walsh, said he wasn't surprised because Hartwell had been asking for more hands-on implementation support for months, and we kept telling them that wasn't part of our service model. Isabella's voice was getting more agitated. Apparently, Trevor suggested that we could modify our approach to include more implementation assistance, but the executive team said it would be too expensive and would set a precedent that other clients might expect. This was exactly the kind of organizational inflexibility that I'd been counting on when I designed our competitive strategy. Large consulting firms like Global Tech were trapped by their own business models. They couldn't easily adapt to client demands for more comprehensive service because their profitability depended on maintaining clear boundaries between analysis and implementation. So what happens now? I asked. Now I have to figure out how to prevent this from happening again. The executive team is treating this like an isolated incident, but I'm worried it's a sign of something bigger. If there are consulting firms out there offering guaranteed results with performance-based contracts, we could lose more clients who want that kind of accountability. Isabella was right to be worried, because losing Hartwell Manufacturing was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, I plan to target 3 more Global Tech clients whose contracts were coming up for renewal. Not through aggressive sales tactics, but by offering them exactly what they'd been asking their current consultants to provide but couldn't get. Have you talked to anyone else in the industry about this Meridian Dynamics company? I asked, curious about what intelligence Isabella might have gathered. I called David Chen at TechFlow. You remember, the guy the first met at the Innovation Summit last year. Turns out TechFlow was one of Meridian Dynamics' first clients, and David couldn't stop raving about their results. He said they didn't just analyze TechFlow's expansion strategy, they actually helped implement it and stayed involved until every performance metric was met. I remember David Chen very well, since he'd become one of our strongest advocates and had referred 4 other clients to us. What Isabella didn't know was that David had also agreed to serve as a reference for our other proposals, specifically because he was so impressed with our approach. Did David give you any other information about them? He said their CEO is brilliant but keeps a low profile. Apparently, Chen prefers to let the work speak for itself rather than doing the conference circuit like most consulting executives. Isabella paused. He also said something interesting, that Meridian Dynamics seems to understand both strategy and operations in a way that most firms don't. Like they bridge the gap between high-level planning and practical execution. This was exactly the reputation I'd been building, and hearing Isabella describe it back to me felt like validation that our positioning was working. We weren't just another consulting firm competing on price or relationships. We were offering something fundamentally different that addressed real frustrations clients had with traditional consulting approaches. So what's your plan? I asked. I'm going to do some more research on them, try to understand their methodology better. Maybe I can convince our executive team that we need to adapt our service model to compete with firms like this. Isabella sighed. The problem is that Global Tech's leadership still thinks traditional consulting is fine, because most of our clients renew their contracts. They don't realize that clients might be renewing because they don't know there are better alternatives. As Isabella spoke, I was looking at my calendar for the rest of the week, which included client meetings with 2 other companies that were currently working with Global Tech. Both had reached out to us after hearing about our work with other clients, and both were asking exactly the kinds of questions that suggested they were evaluating alternatives to their current consulting relationships. Isabella was right that this was the beginning of something bigger. But what she didn't understand was that it wasn't an industry trend she needed to adapt to. It was a competitive strategy specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses in Global Tech's business model. I'm sure you'll figure out how to handle it, I told her. You've always been good at adapting to new challenges. Thanks, she said, though she still sounded uncertain. I just have this feeling that the consulting industry is changing faster than we're keeping up with. And I don't want to be left behind because we were too slow to recognize what clients actually want. After we hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the city skyline and realized that phase 3 of my plan was working even better than I'd expected. Isabella wasn't just losing clients to Meridian Dynamics. She was starting to understand that our approach represented a fundamental challenge to everything she thought she knew about successful consulting. The question was whether she'd be able to convince Global Tech to change their business model, or whether she'd eventually decide that the only way to do the kind of consulting she was describing was to work for a firm that had already figured it out. Either way, the first strike had landed exactly where I'd intended it to. By December of that year, Isabella's calls were coming more frequently, and with an increasingly frantic undertone. What had started as confusion about losing one client had evolved into something approaching career crisis, as the pattern became impossible to ignore. Meridian Dynamics wasn't just competing with Global Tech. We were systematically dismantling their client base, one carefully targeted contract at a time. The second domino fell in October, when Riverside Financial Services announced they were ending their 5-year relationship with Global Tech, to work with a more innovative consulting partner. Isabella didn't call me about that one, but I heard about her reaction through Marcus Rivera, who'd maintained connections throughout the industry and kept me informed about competitive intelligence. According to Marcus, Isabella had presented a detailed analysis to Global Tech's executive committee about what she called the Meridian dynamics problem. She'd identified patterns in their client losses, documented the specific service gaps that clients were citing when they left, and proposed a comprehensive restructuring of Global Tech's service model to compete with what she described as implementation-focused consulting approaches. The executive committee's response was exactly what I'd predicted. They thanked Isabella for her analysis and formed a task force to study the issue further. No immediate changes to their business model. No authorization to experiment with performance-based contracts. Just more meetings and internal deliberation while their clients continued to evaluate alternatives. The third domino fell in November when Crescent Manufacturing Group, a client that Global Tech had worked with for 7 years, switched to Meridian Dynamics after what their CEO described as frustration with consulting relationships that generate reports but don't create lasting change. That loss prompted Isabella's most distressed call yet. "Sophia, I'm starting to think I'm in the wrong business," she said, and for the first time in our adult lives, she sounded genuinely defeated. "Everything I learned about consulting, everything I thought made a firm successful, it's like none of it matters anymore." I was in my office reviewing quarterly financials that showed Meridian Dynamics had grown 340% since our launch 18 months earlier. We now employed 42 people, had offices in 3 cities, and were booked solid through the following summer. The success was beyond anything I'd projected in my original business plan. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "I mean that everything I was taught about professional services, building relationships, demonstrating expertise, maintaining boundaries between strategy and implementation, all of that seems to be getting turned upside down by firms like Meridian Dynamics." Isabella went on to explain that she'd finally managed to get a meeting with Patricia Morrison, the CEO of Hartwell Manufacturing, to understand why they'd switched consulting firms. What Patricia told her had shaken everything Isabella thought she knew about client relationships. Patricia said that Global Tech's team was technically excellent and professionally polished, but they felt like hired experts who came in, analyzed problems, provided recommendations, and then disappeared, Isabella explained. She said working with Meridian Dynamics was completely different because they acted like partners who were invested in Hartwell's actual success, not just in delivering a good report. This was precisely the client experience I designed Meridian Dynamics to create. Instead of maintaining the professional distance that traditional consulting firms use to protect their liability and maximize their billing efficiency, we embedded ourselves in our clients' operations until we achieved measurable results. We weren't just consultants. We were temporary members of their executive teams. Patricia also said something that really bothered me, Isabella continued. She said that when Global Tech presented their recommendations, it felt like they were solving theoretical problems. But when Meridian Dynamics presented their approach, it felt like they'd actually worked in manufacturing before and understood the practical challenges of implementing changes in a real operational environment. I had to suppress a smile at that feedback, because it was exactly the competitive advantage I'd been building toward. While traditional consulting firms hired people with impressive academic credentials and theoretical frameworks, I'd been recruiting consultants who had actual operational experience in the industries we served. Our manufacturing team included former plant managers, supply chain directors, and quality control executives who'd actually implemented the kinds of changes we were recommending. But the conversation took an interesting turn when Isabella started talking about her attempts to research Meridian Dynamics more thoroughly. "I've been trying to learn more about their methodology, but it's almost impossible to find detailed information about how they operate," she said. "Their website talks about implementation partnerships and transformation guarantees, but they don't publish case studies or white papers like most consulting firms. It's like they're deliberately keeping their approach proprietary." This was another intentional strategic decision. While firms like Global Tech built their reputations through thought leadership and industry publications, I'd focused on building our reputation through client results and word-of-mouth referrals. We didn't need to publish case studies because our clients were enthusiastically recommending us to their peers. "Maybe they're just focused on client work instead of marketing," I suggested, echoing what I'd said in our previous conversation. "That's what's so frustrating," Isabella replied. "They're obviously successful. I've heard estimates that they're growing faster than any consulting firm in the region, but they're doing it without any of the visibility strategies that business schools teach. You are essential for professional services firms." What Isabella didn't understand was that our growth wasn't despite our low public profile. It was because of it. By focusing entirely on client results rather than industry recognition, we'd built the kind of reputation that traditional marketing couldn't buy. Our clients weren't just satisfied, they were genuinely grateful for the transformations we'd helped them achieve. And that gratitude translated into referrals that were far more valuable than any conference presentation or published article. The worst part, Isabella continued, is that I'm starting to think they're right. When I look at the projects I've worked on over the past 2 years, I can see that we've delivered a lot of sophisticated analysis and strategic recommendations. But I'm not sure how many of our clients have actually achieved the kinds of improvements that they hired us to help them make. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, Isabella beginning to question not just Global Tech's approach, but the entire traditional consulting model she'd built her career around. She was starting to understand that there was a fundamental difference between being a smart consultant and being an effective one. Have you talked to your management about these concerns? I asked. I've tried, but they keep telling me that client retention is still strong and our revenue growth is on target. They think the companies that left us are outliers who had unrealistic expectations about what consulting firms should provide. Isabella's frustration was evident, but I don't think they're outliers. I think they're early indicators of what all clients are going to start expecting. She was absolutely right, and her insight was exactly what I'd been hoping she'd develop. The market was changing, and traditional consulting firms were going to have to adapt or lose relevance. The question was whether Isabella would try to change Global Tech from within, or whether she'd eventually conclude that the only way to do the kind of consulting she was describing was to work somewhere that had already figured it out. There's something else, Isabella said, and her voice took on a different tone. I heard through the industry network that Meridian Dynamics is hiring for several senior positions, director-level roles with what sounds like significant autonomy and the chance to work on the kind of transformational projects that actually make a difference. My pulse quickened. This was moving faster than I'd anticipated. Isabella was already aware of our hiring plans, which meant she might be closer to considering a career change than I'd expected. Are you thinking about applying? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. I don't know, she said, but the way she said it suggested she'd already been thinking about it seriously. Part of me is curious about what it would be like to work for a firm that's actually succeeding with the approach I keep telling Global Tech we should adopt. But part of me wonders if I'm just frustrated because we lost some clients and I'm overreacting. As Isabella talked through her conflicted feelings about potentially making a career change, I was looking at the job description my HR team had finalized that morning for our senior strategy director position. It was specifically designed to appeal to someone with Isabella's background, someone who had traditional consulting experience but wanted to focus on implementation and measurable results, rather than just analysis and recommendations. What would you do if you were in my position? Isabella asked. It was a question that required careful consideration, because my answer could influence whether Isabella would eventually apply to work for the company I'd built. But I also wanted to give her genuine advice, because despite everything that had happened between us over the years, she was still my sister. I think you should trust your instincts, I said finally. If you're seeing problems that your current firm's leadership isn't addressing, and if there are other firms that are successfully solving those problems, maybe it's worth exploring what they're doing differently. You're right, Isabella said, and I could hear the decision forming in her voice. I think I need to at least learn more about how firms like Meridian Dynamics operate. Even if I don't end up making a career change, it would help me understand what we're competing against. After we hung up, I sat in my office realizing that everything was accelerating toward the moment I'd been building toward for almost 2 years. Isabella wasn't just aware of Meridian Dynamics anymore. She was actively considering joining us. The only question was whether she'd recognize her sister when she walked into that interview room, or whether her assumptions about my career would blind her to what I'd actually built. Either way, it was going to be the most interesting conversation of my professional life. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday in January, nearly 2 years after I'd launched Meridian Dynamics. I was in my home office reviewing proposals for our expansion into the Denver market, when my phone rang with Isabella's name on the screen. In all our years as adults, she had never called me that late unless there was some kind of family emergency. Sophia, are you awake? Her voice was strained, exhausted in a way that immediately told me this wasn't about our parents or any kind of personal crisis. This was about work, and whatever had happened was serious enough to keep Isabella up past midnight on a weeknight. I'm awake, what's going on? I just got out of the longest, most humiliating meeting of my entire career. Isabella's voice cracked slightly. Global Tech is restructuring the entire strategic consulting division, and I'm being reassigned to what they're calling, quote, legacy client management. Do you know what that means? I had a pretty good idea what that meant, but I needed to hear it from her perspective. Tell me. It means they're taking me off new business development and putting me in charge of managing relationships with clients who've been with the firm for more than 5 years. Clients who are unlikely to leave because they're either too risk-averse to change consulting firms or too entrenched in our processes to switch. Isabella's bitterness was palpable. Essentially, they're making me a glorified account manager for clients who don't require strategic thinking. What Isabella didn't know was that Marcus Rivera had called me 3 hours earlier with advance intelligence about Global Tech's reorganization. The restructuring wasn't just about Isabella. It was a company-wide response to what their leadership was finally acknowledging as a competitive crisis. They'd lost 12 major clients in the past 8 months, 6 of them to Meridian Dynamics, and their new business pipeline had slowed dramatically as potential clients increasingly sought consulting firms that offered implementation guarantees. What prompted the restructuring? I asked, though I already knew the answer.
Officially, they're calling it a strategic realignment to focus on core competencies and optimize resource allocation. Isabella's tone made it clear what she thought of that corporate speak. Unofficially, we're hemorrhaging clients to firms like Meridian Dynamics, and the executive team is panicking because they can't figure out how to compete with consulting approaches they don't understand. The irony was exquisite. Isabella was being demoted because of the success of the company I'd built, using strategies I'd developed specifically to exploit the weaknesses in firms like Global Tech. But from her perspective, she was just another victim of industry changes that seemed to come out of nowhere. Did they give you any explanation for why you specifically were reassigned? The official reason is that my expertise in relationship management makes me the ideal person to ensure client retention in our existing portfolio. Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in it. The real reason is that I've spent the past year telling them we need to fundamentally change our business model to compete with implementation-focused firms, and they're tired of hearing it. This was exactly what I'd hoped would happen. Isabella had been arguing for changes that Global Tech's leadership couldn't or wouldn't implement, positioning herself as someone who understood the market shift, but was trapped in an organization that was too rigid to adapt. She was primed for recruitment by a firm that had already figured out what she was trying to convince Global Tech to do. "What's your plan now?" I asked. "Honestly, I'm not sure I have one. I could stay at Global Tech and manage legacy accounts, but that feels like professional suicide. I could try to find another position at a traditional consulting firm, but the whole industry seems to be struggling with the same issues." Isabella paused, and I could hear her typing. Or I could take a completely different approach and try to join one of these newer firms that's actually succeeding with implementation-focused consulting. My heart rate increased. This was the moment I'd been building toward for 2 years. Isabella recognizing that her future lay with a firm like Meridian Dynamics, rather than trying to reform a traditional consulting company from within. Have you looked into any of these newer firms? I've done some research, but it's frustrating because most of them don't have the kind of visible leadership that you see at established firms. Take Meridian Dynamics, for example. I've been trying to learn about their CEO, Chen, for months, but there's almost no public information available. No conference presentations, no published articles, no industry profiles. I had to admire Isabella's persistence in researching my company, even as I was grateful for the operational security that had kept my identity hidden. Maybe that's because they're focused on client work instead of personal branding. Maybe, but it makes it hard to know whether I'd want to work there. I mean, their results speak for themselves. Every client I've talked to raves about their experience with Meridian Dynamics. But I'd want to understand the leadership philosophy and company culture before making a career change. As Isabella spoke, I was looking at the application portal on my computer screen, where her resume had been submitted 6 hours earlier. She'd applied for our Senior Strategy Director position, the role I'd specifically designed to appeal to someone with her background and frustrations. Her cover letter was professionally written and strategically positioned, but what struck me most was the underlying desperation that came through despite her polished language. "I actually applied for a position there tonight," Isabella continued, confirming what I'd already discovered. "I know it's probably a long shot, but I figure the worst they can say is no. And honestly, at this point, I need to explore alternatives that might actually allow me to do the kind of consulting work I believe in." "What kind of position did you apply for?" "Senior Strategy Director." The job description was almost exactly what I've been trying to convince Global Tech to let me do. Leading implementation-focused client engagements with measurable performance targets and long-term partnership models. Isabella's voice gained energy as she described the role. It's like someone designed a position specifically for consultants who are frustrated with traditional approaches but want to work on transformational projects. Someone had designed the position specifically for consultants like Isabella, but that someone was me. Every requirement in the job description, every responsibility outlined, every qualification listed, had been crafted to appeal to ambitious consultants who felt constrained by the limitations of traditional consulting firms. When do you think you'll hear back from them?
According to their automated response, they'll be scheduling interviews over the next 2 weeks. But honestly, I'm not getting my hopes up. A firm that's successful probably has their pick of candidates, and my experience is all in traditional consulting. Isabella sighed. I just hope they're at least willing to have a conversation about what it would look like for someone with my background to transition into their approach. What Isabella didn't know was that her traditional consulting background wasn't a liability. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. I wanted someone who understood the limitations of conventional approaches and was motivated to do something different. I wanted someone who'd experienced the frustration of working in an organization that couldn't adapt to changing client needs. Most importantly, I wanted someone whose recruitment would send a clear message to the industry that Meridian Dynamics wasn't just competing with traditional consulting firms. We were attracting their top talent. There's something else, Isabella said, and her tone shifted to something I'd never heard from her before: genuine vulnerability. I keep thinking about what you said last time we talked, about trusting my instincts. Well, my instincts are telling me that everything I learned about building a successful consulting career might be wrong. This was the most honest thing Isabella had ever said to me about her professional doubts, and despite everything that had happened between us over the years, I felt a genuine sympathy for what she was going through. She was questioning not just her current job, but the entire foundation of her career identity. What do you mean? I mean that I spent years building expertise in relationship management, business development, and strategic analysis. All the things that business school teaches you are essential for consulting success. But now I'm watching firms like Meridian Dynamics succeed by focusing on things that weren't even part of my education: implementation support, performance guarantees, embedded partnerships. It's like they're playing a completely different game. Isabella was right that we were playing a different game, but what she didn't understand was that I'd learned to play it by watching her play the traditional game and identifying all the ways it failed to serve clients effectively. Maybe the game has changed, I suggested. That's what scares me. If the game has changed, then all the expertise I've built, all the recognition I've earned, all the relationships I've developed, none of it might matter anymore. Isabella's voice was quiet now, reflective. I might have to start over and learn an entirely new approach to consulting. As Isabella talked about the possibility of starting over, I realized that she was closer to the truth than she knew. She wouldn't have to start over if she joined Meridian Dynamics. She'd be able to build on her existing expertise while learning new approaches that address the gaps she'd identified in traditional consulting. But first, she'd have to get through an interview with the CEO she'd been researching for months, the mysterious Chen, who'd built the company that was systematically dismantling everything she thought she knew about consulting success. The CEO, who happened to be her sister. I should probably try to get some sleep, Isabella said finally. I have a feeling the next few weeks are going to determine the direction of my entire career. After we hung up, I sat in my office staring at Isabella's application on my screen and realized that everything was converging exactly as I'd planned. Isabella was professionally desperate, intellectually curious about our approach, and ready to take the kind of career risk that would bring her directly into my sphere. The only question remaining was whether she'd recognize me when she walked into that interview room, or whether her assumptions about my success would blind her to the reality of what I'd built. Either way, in 2 weeks, Isabella would be sitting across from me, asking for a job at the company I'd created while she was celebrating her rise through the traditional consulting world. And I would finally get to see the look on her face when she realized that her unsuccessful sister had built the empire she desperately wanted to join. The moment Isabella realized she was interviewing with her own sister was even more devastating than I'd imagined it would be. After the initial shock wore off and we'd established that yes, I was the CEO of Meridian Dynamics, and yes, she desperately wanted the job I was offering, something shifted in the room that went beyond professional dynamics or family history. For the first time in our adult lives, Isabella was completely dependent on my approval for something she wanted, and we both knew it. So I said, after we'd moved past the initial revelation and settled into what was ostensibly a normal interview. Tell me why you think you'd be a good fit for Meridian Dynamics. Isabella had regained some of her composure, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her portfolio. Everything about her body language screamed desperation masked by professional training. She needed this job not just for career advancement, but for professional survival. Based on my research into your company's methodology, I believe my experience in traditional consulting would actually be an asset in this role, she began, her voice steadier than I'd expected. I understand the limitations of conventional approaches because I've lived them. I know why clients get frustrated with firms that deliver reports without implementation support, because I've been part of teams that created that frustration. It was a smart answer, positioning her traditional background as insight rather than limitation. But there was something else in her tone, a humility I'd never heard from Isabella before. She wasn't trying to impress me with her achievements. She was trying to convince me that she understood why those achievements weren't enough anymore. Can you give me a specific example of a time when you recognized the limitations of traditional consulting approaches? Isabella was quiet for a moment, and I could see her wrestling with how honest to be. Finally, she spoke with a candor that surprised me. The Crescent Manufacturing Project. We spent 4 months analyzing their operational inefficiencies and delivered a comprehensive report with 17 specific recommendations for improvement. The client was initially thrilled. They said it was the most thorough analysis they'd ever received. Isabella paused, looking directly at me. 6 months later, they'd implemented maybe 3 of our recommendations, and their operational metrics were essentially unchanged. They'd paid us $180,000 for a report that sat on their CEO's shelf. I knew about the Crescent Manufacturing Project, not just because they'd eventually become one of our clients, but because their CEO, Jennifer Walsh, had specifically mentioned their frustration with Global Tech's approach when she hired us. What Isabella didn't know was that Jennifer had kept Global Tech's report and used it as a reference document while we helped her implement the changes her company actually needed. What do you think went wrong with that project? Everything, Isabella said without hesitation. We treated the engagement like an academic exercise, instead of a business transformation. We analyzed their problems brilliantly, but we didn't stay around to help them solve the practical challenges of actually changing how they operated. We gave them a perfect diagnosis and then left them to figure out the cure on their own. This was exactly the kind of insight I'd been hoping to hear from Isabella. She wasn't just frustrated with Global Tech's approach. She understood why it failed clients and was ready to do something different. So how would you have handled that project differently? I would have structured it as a partnership rather than a service engagement. Instead of a 4-month analysis followed by a final report, I would have proposed a 12-month collaboration with implementation milestones and measurable performance targets. Isabella was gaining confidence as she spoke, describing exactly the approach Meridian Dynamics had used with similar clients. The goal wouldn't be to deliver perfect recommendations. It would be to help Crescent Manufacturing achieve specific operational improvements that showed up in their bottom line. As Isabella outlined her vision for client engagement, I realized something that changed my entire perspective on this conversation. She wasn't just desperate for a job at my company. She genuinely understood and believed in the approach I'd built Meridian Dynamics around. Her frustration with traditional consulting wasn't just professional disappointment. It was intellectual conviction about how consulting should work. Isabella, I said, setting down my pen and looking at her directly. I need to ask you something personal. How does it feel to be sitting here, interviewing with me, for a position at my company? The question hung in the air between us, and I watched Isabella process not just what I was asking, but what I was really asking. How did it feel to discover that the sister she'd dismissed as unambitious had built the exact career she'd always wanted for herself? Honestly? Isabella's voice was quiet, but steady. It's humbling in a way I didn't expect. I spent years thinking I understood what success looked like in consulting, and it turns out I was completely wrong. You built something I couldn't even imagine, using approaches I didn't know existed. That's not what I asked. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight I'd never heard from her before. It feels like everything I thought I knew about our relationship was backwards. I spent years feeling sorry for you because I thought you were settling for mediocrity, when actually you were building something extraordinary. I was so focused on climbing someone else's ladder that I never noticed you were constructing your own building. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received from Isabella, and it was more genuine than anything she'd ever said to me about our professional lives. Do you remember what you told me at Rachel's wedding? About someone in the family being willing to settle for mediocrity? Isabella winced. I remember. And I was completely wrong. You weren't settling for anything. You were planning something I was too narrow-minded to see. And if I offered you this position, working for the company I built, while you were celebrating your success at Global Tech, could you handle that dynamic? This was the crucial question, because it wasn't just about Isabella's qualifications or even her desperation. It was about whether she could psychologically handle working for her younger sister, taking direction from the person she'd spent years treating as professionally inferior. Sophia, I know how this looks. I know that from your perspective, I'm the sister who dismissed your career for years and then came crawling to you for a job when my own career fell apart. Isabella met my eyes directly. But I'm not asking you to hire me because we're family. I'm asking you to hire me because I understand what you've built here, and I want to be part of it. Even if it means acknowledging that my approach to consulting is fundamentally superior to everything you spent years trying to achieve. Especially because of that. Isabella's response was immediate and firm. I don't want to keep doing consulting the wrong way just to protect my ego. I want to learn how to do it the right way, even if that means admitting I've been wrong about almost everything. As Isabella spoke, I realized that this conversation had evolved beyond the interview I'd originally planned. She wasn't just applying for a job. She was asking for a chance to completely reconstruct her professional identity around principles I'd developed. But there was one more test I needed to conduct, one final question that would determine whether this interview ended with a job offer or a final goodbye. Isabella, if I hire you, you'll be working directly with some of the clients you lost when you were at Global Tech. Hartwell Manufacturing, Crescent Manufacturing, Riverside Financial. They'll all know that you used to work for the firm they left to work with us. How are you going to handle those relationships? Isabella was quiet for almost a minute, and I could see her thinking through the implications of what I was asking. Finally, she looked up at me with something that looked like relief. I'm going to tell them the truth. That I was part of a consulting approach that didn't serve them well, and now I want to help them succeed with a methodology that actually works. I'm not going to pretend that my previous work was adequate, because it wasn't. Isabella paused. And if they're uncomfortable working with me because of my history with Global Tech, I'll step aside and let other team members handle those relationships. It was the perfect answer, and more importantly, it was an honest answer. Isabella was ready to completely abandon her previous professional identity in favor of something better. The position pays $220,000 base salary, plus performance bonuses, tied to client success metrics. Your first review would be in 6 months, with promotion opportunities based on results rather than tenure. You'd be leading implementation teams for major transformation projects, and your success would be measured by actual client outcomes, not billable hours or client satisfaction surveys. Isabella's eyes widened. The compensation package was significantly higher than what she'd been making at Global Tech, but more importantly, the performance structure was exactly what she'd been arguing for in her previous role. Are you offering me the job? I looked at my sister, brilliant, ambitious, humbled by circumstances she'd never seen coming, and realized that everything had led to this moment. Years of family dynamics, professional competition, and strategic planning had brought us to a place where she was asking me to rebuild her career around principles she'd finally learned to value. Yes, Isabella, I'm offering you the job. The question is, are you ready to take it? The smile that spread across her face was different from any expression I'd ever seen from her. It wasn't the triumphant grin of someone who'd won a competition or achieved a goal. It was the relieved smile of someone who'd finally found their way to where they were supposed to be. Yes, she said, I'm ready. And for the first time in our adult lives, I believed she actually was. Yalla. 6 months after Isabella's first day at Meridian Dynamics, I'm sitting in the same office where this entire story began, but everything about my world has transformed in ways I never could have predicted when I first started planning my company. The Isabella who walks through my door now for our weekly one-on-one meetings bears almost no resemblance to the sister who used to dismiss my career as a dead-end office job. She knocks, waits for permission to enter, and sits down across from my desk with a quarterly performance report that represents not just her own professional growth, but a complete vindication of everything I built Meridian Dynamics to achieve. The Hartwell Manufacturing project wrapped up this week, Isabella says, setting down a folder that I know contains metrics that would have been impossible to achieve using Global Tech's traditional consulting approach. Final results: 31% improvement in production efficiency, 28% reduction in waste costs, and 94% employee satisfaction with the transition process. Jennifer Walsh said it was the most successful operational transformation in the company's history. I review the numbers, but what strikes me most isn't the exceptional performance. It's the confidence in Isabella's voice as she presents results that are measured in real business impact rather than client satisfaction surveys or project completion rates. She's learned to define success the way Meridian Dynamics defines success, by the measurable improvements we create in our clients' actual operations. How did it feel, working with Jennifer after everything that happened with the global tech engagement? Isabella smiles, and it's the same kind of relieved smile she had when I offered her the job, but now it carries something else, genuine professional pride based on results she knows she earned. Honestly, it felt like redemption. Jennifer told me that she'd kept Global Tech's original report and used it as a reference during our implementation process, but she said the difference was that this time, she had consultants who helped her turn analysis into action. Isabella pauses, organizing her thoughts. She also said something that really stuck with me. She said that working with the old Isabella felt like hiring experts to tell her what was wrong, but working with the new Isabella felt like hiring partners to help her make things right. This is exactly the transformation I'd hoped to see, not just in Isabella's approach to client work, but in her understanding of what consulting should accomplish. She stopped thinking like someone who delivers expertise and started thinking like someone who delivers results. What's next for you professionally? I ask, because after 6 months of watching Isabella adapt to our methodology, I'm curious about how she sees her future developing. Marcus and I have been talking about the possibility of me leading our expansion into the Portland market. There are at least 8 companies up there that are dealing with exactly the kinds of operational challenges we specialize in solving, and several of them have expressed frustration with traditional consulting approaches. Isabella leans forward, and I can see the strategic thinking that made her successful at Global Tech, but now applied to implementation-focused business development. I think I could build a team that would be generating $5 million in annual revenue within 18 months. The proposal is ambitious, well-researched, and exactly the kind of entrepreneurial thinking that Meridian Dynamics needs as we continue expanding. But what impresses me most is that Isabella is talking about building something rather than just managing something. She's learned to think like an owner rather than an employee. Tell me about the team you'd want to build. I'd recruit from 2 sources: experienced consultants who are frustrated with traditional firms, and industry experts who want to transition into consulting but don't want to work for companies that treat implementation as someone else's problem. Isabella opens her portfolio to a page of detailed notes. The Portland market is full of manufacturing and logistics companies that need the kind of hands-on transformation support we provide, but they're underserved because the big consulting firms focus on tech companies in Seattle. As Isabella outlines her expansion strategy, I realize that she's not just proposing to replicate what we've built in Riverside, she's proposing to adapt our methodology to a different market with different needs. She's learned to think systematically about how our approach can be scaled and customized. What would you do differently in Portland than what we've done here? I'd put even more emphasis on hiring consultants with direct operational experience in manufacturing and logistics. The companies up there want to work with people who've actually run production facilities or managed supply chains, not just people who've studied those industries. Isabella's confidence is evident. I'd also partner with local business schools to develop case studies about implementation-focused consulting, so we can start building a pipeline of talent that already understands our approach. The strategy is sophisticated, practical, and demonstrates that Isabella has internalized not just our methodology, but our philosophy about what makes consulting valuable. She's thinking about long-term market development rather than short-term revenue generation. But there's something else I need to understand about Isabella's transformation, something more personal than her professional development. Isabella, I need to ask you something that goes beyond work. How do you feel about our family dynamics now? How do you feel about coming to family dinners, where I'm no longer the sister with the little consulting job? Isabella is quiet for a moment, and I can see her considering not just what to say, but whether she's ready to be completely honest about something that goes to the core of our relationship. It's been harder than I expected, she says finally, not because I'm jealous of your success. I mean, I was initially, but that passed pretty quickly once I started working here and understood what you'd actually built. It's hard because I keep realizing how wrong I was about everything. What do you mean? I mean that every family dinner is a reminder that I spent years feeling superior to someone who is actually light years ahead of me. Mom and Dad still don't fully understand what either of us does professionally, But now when they ask about work, I have to talk about my job as a director at your company, rather than my independent career achievements. Isabella meets my eyes directly. It's humbling in a way that I needed but didn't expect. This level of self-awareness from Isabella represents perhaps the most significant change in our relationship since we were children. She's not just acknowledging that she was wrong about my career. She's accepting that being wrong taught her something valuable about herself. Do you regret how things worked out? Not for a second. Isabella's response is immediate and firm. I regret that it took me so long to figure out what you'd been building, and I regret that I dismissed you for years instead of learning from you. But I don't regret ending up here, even if the path was more humbling than I would have chosen. And what about the future? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Isabella grins, and for the first time it reminds me of the ambitious sister I grew up with, but tempered by the humility she's learned and focused on the kind of results-driven goals that actually matter. In 5 years, I want to be running Meridian Dynamics Northwest with offices in Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. I want to have proven that our implementation-focused approach works in different markets and different industries. And I want to have developed the next generation of consultants who think about client success the way you taught me to think about it. It's exactly the kind of ambitious, strategic vision that I'd expect from Isabella, but grounded in the practical, results-oriented methodology that makes Meridian Dynamics successful. That's a big goal. I learned from the best, Isabella says, and there's no irony in her voice, just recognition of something that took her years to understand. As Isabella gathers her reports and prepares to leave for her next client meeting, I realize that this story isn't just about professional competition or family dynamics or business success. It's about something more fundamental, the difference between appearing successful and actually creating value. Isabella spent years building a career that looked impressive from the outside: prestigious firm, elevated titles, industry recognition, but ultimately delivered limited value to the client she was supposed to serve. I spent those same years building something that looked modest from the outside but created measurable, lasting improvements in every organization we touched. The lesson isn't that ambition is wrong, or that traditional career paths are worthless, or that family competition is inherently destructive. The lesson is that the best way to achieve recognition is to focus on results rather than recognition itself. Isabella learned this lesson the hard way, through professional failure and personal humiliation that forced her to question everything she thought she knew about success. But she learned it completely, and now she's building a career based on creating value rather than managing perceptions. And me? I learned that the most satisfying victory isn't proving someone wrong. It's helping them become right. The sister who once mocked my dead-end job is now one of Meridian Dynamics' most valuable directors, leading client transformations that generate millions of dollars in measurable improvements. The family dynamics that once made me feel invisible now showcase a collaboration that our parents brag about to their colleagues. Most importantly, the business I built to prove that implementation-focused consulting was superior to traditional approaches has become something bigger than competitive advantage. It's become a platform for helping other professionals, including my own sister, discover what they're actually capable of achieving when they focus on results instead of appearances. That's the real transformation. Not just changing how Isabella and I relate to each other, but changing how we both think about what work should accomplish and what success should look like. And that transformation, unlike the quarterly metrics or revenue projections or client satisfaction scores, is something that will last long after both of our careers are over. Because the best business strategy isn't about beating your competition. It's about becoming so good at creating value that competition becomes irrelevant. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, your competition becomes your greatest success story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.